At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched under the left wing of a P-38 Lightning at Dobadura Airfield in New Guinea, watching his pilot prepare for a mission he probably wouldn't survive. The pilot was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 23 years old, 6 combat missions, 0 kills. The Japanese had sent 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters to intercept the morning patrol. Hayes would be flying straight into them. McKenna had been maintaining P-38s for 8 months. He knew the aircraft inside and out. Twin-engine fighter, twin-boom design, fast in a straight line, absolute beast at high altitude. But the P-38 had one fatal problem that was killing American pilots every single day. It couldn't turn with a Zero. The Zero was lighter, more agile. It could execute a full horizontal turn in half the time a P-38 needed. In a dogfight, that difference meant death. American doctrine said P-38 pilots should never turn with a Zero, never try to outmaneuver them. Use speed, use altitude, dive in, shoot, climb out, hit and run. Don't get caught in a turning fight. Hayes had tried that doctrine 5 times. It hadn't worked. The Zeros were too smart. They baited American pilots into turns, cut inside their turning radius, got on their tail, shot them down. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in the past 6 weeks. Most were shot down after being caught in turning engagements they couldn't escape. McKenna had watched too many pilots die. Good men. Kids, really. They climbed into their P-38s with confidence and came back in boxes. Or didn't come back at all. The training manual said the problem was pilot error. The instructors said these pilots weren't following doctrine, but McKenna knew better. The problem wasn't the pilots. It was the control cables. The P-38's aileron control cables ran through the twin booms to the tail section, then forward through pulleys to the wing control surfaces. The cable system had slack. Not much, maybe 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. But that tiny bit of slack created a delay between stick movement and aileron response. At high speeds, it didn't matter. At low speeds, during hard turning maneuvers, that fraction of a second delay was the difference between rolling inside a Zero's turn and getting shot down. McKenna had mentioned this to the engineering officer 2 months ago. The officer said the cable tension was within specifications. Factory tolerances allowed for that slack. Changing it would void the aircraft warranty. Besides, no field mechanic had authorization to modify flight control systems. That required engineering approval from Lockheed, and Lockheed was 7,000 miles away in California. So McKenna did something that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual. He took a piece of piano wire from a damaged aircraft, cut it to 6 inches, bent it into a Z-shape, and installed it as a tensioner on Lieutenant Hayes' left aileron control cable. The modification took 8 minutes. It added 0.4 pounds of tension to the cable. It eliminated the slack completely. Nobody noticed. The inspection crew didn't check cable tension that morning. They were focused on engine oil levels and ammunition loads. McKenna said nothing. He watched Hayes taxi to the runway, watched him take off, watched the P-38 disappear into the morning sky toward the Japanese fighters. What happened in the next 17 minutes would change how every P-38 in the Pacific Theater flew. The first pilot McKenna lost to a Zero was Lieutenant David Chen, July 9, 1943. Chen had been in theater for 3 weeks. McKenna had worked on his aircraft every morning. They talked about California. Chen was from Sacramento. McKenna was from Long Beach. They had both worked on cars before the war. Chen took off at 06:15 on a fighter sweep over Leh. He came back 2 hours later with 3 bullet holes in his left boom and a story about a Zero that had gotten inside his turn. Chen said he tried to roll out and dive away like the manual said, but the airplane felt slow to respond, like there was a delay between when he moved the stick and when the aircraft actually rolled. The Zero almost got him. Only thing that saved him was his wingman shooting the Zero off his tail. McKenna looked at the bullet holes. They were in a tight group. Perfect deflection shooting. The Zero pilot had led Chen perfectly, had anticipated exactly where Chen's airplane would be. That shouldn't have been possible if Chen had rolled hard and dove immediately. Unless the airplane had delayed just long enough for the Zero to get the lead right. Chen didn't fly again. His aircraft went back to the depot for repairs. McKenna never saw him again. 3 weeks later, he heard Chen had been killed flying a different P-38 over Rabaul. Same story. Caught in a turning fight. Couldn't roll out fast enough. The second pilot was Captain William Morrison. Morrison was a flight leader. Experienced. 11 kills. He knew the P-38 inside and out, knew its limitations, flew smart. On August 3rd, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison got 1 Zero on the first pass, came around for another run, 2 Zeros reversed on him. McKenna heard the radio traffic afterward. Morrison tried to roll inverted and split S away, called out that his controls felt mushy. The Zeros stayed with him through the maneuver, shot him down at 4,000 feet. Morrison's wingman said it looked like Morrison's airplane wasn't responding fast enough, like he was fighting the controls. Morrison died in the crash. Morrison's crew chief was a friend of McKenna's, a guy named Rodriguez from Texas. Rodriguez was convinced there was something wrong with Morrison's aircraft. He checked everything after they recovered the wreckage. Engine settings, control surface rigging, cable tensions. Everything was within spec. Nothing wrong with the airplane. The official report said pilot error. Rodriguez didn't believe it. Neither did McKenna. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. Some he knew well. Most he'd only met briefly while doing pre-flight checks. But he'd worked on all their aircraft, had signed off their maintenance logs, had watched them taxi out, watched them take off. Some came back. Some didn't. The ones who came back told the same story. The P-38 felt slow to respond in hard maneuvering, like there was a slight lag between control input and aircraft reaction. Most pilots thought that was just how the airplane handled. Heavy fighter, big control surfaces. Some delay was expected. But McKenna knew that wasn't normal. He'd felt that delay with his own hands when he worked on the control cables, that tiny bit of slack in the system. He started paying attention to the sound the cables made when he tensioned them during maintenance. There was a specific tone, a sort of low twang when you plucked them. Loose cables sounded different than tight cables. McKenna could hear the difference. Every P-38 on the line had cables that sounded slightly loose, within spec, but loose. He mentioned this to Rodriguez one evening after Morrison died. Rodriguez asked what could be done about it. McKenna said, nothing official, but unofficially there was a solution. It just required breaking regulations that could get them both court-martialed. The problem wasn't that American pilots didn't know what to do. They knew. Every briefing emphasized it. Every training flight drilled it. Never turn with a zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Hit and run. The doctrine was clear. The problem was that combat didn't follow doctrine. Lieutenant Robert Hayes had been in New Guinea for 2 months. 23 years old. Farm kid from Iowa. He'd flown 6 combat missions and had 0 kills. Not because he was a bad pilot. Because he followed the rules. And the rules kept putting him in positions where he couldn't get a shot. On his 3rd mission, Hayes dove on a zero from altitude. Built up speed to 400 miles per hour. Came in from the sun like the manual said. Got the zero in his gun sight. Started to pull lead for deflection. The zero snap rolled left and dove. Hayes tried to follow. His P-38 rolled into the turn but felt like it was moving through mud. By the time his aircraft pointed where he wanted it, the zero was gone. Hayes pulled out. Climbed back to altitude. No shot fired. 4th mission was worse. Hayes and his wingman jumped 2 zeros at 15,000 feet. Hayes got the first burst off. Missed. The zero reversed hard right. Hayes rolled to follow. His wingman called out 2 more zeros coming in from above. Hayes tried to roll back level and dive away. The airplane responded. But slowly. Just slowly enough that one of the diving zeros got a 3-second burst into Hayes' right boom. 20mm cannon shells. They didn't penetrate, but they scared Hayes badly enough that he broke off the engagement and ran for home with his engine smoking. 5th mission, Hayes watched his wingman die. The wingman's name was Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21 years old, Boston. They'd gone through training together. On August 14th, Parker got separated from the formation during a dogfight over Finchhofen. 2 zeros got on his tail. Parker tried everything. Rolled hard, reversed, tried to scissor. The zeros stayed with him through every maneuver. Hayes heard Parker on the radio calling for help, heard the panic in his voice, heard him say his airplane wasn't turning fast enough, heard the gunfire, heard Parker scream. Then nothing. Hayes didn't sleep that night. Neither did most of the squadron. Parker's bed stayed empty. His personal effects got packed up and shipped home. His P-38 was written off as combat loss. The maintenance log noted no mechanical issues. The official cause was pilot error during defensive maneuvering. McKenna had worked on Parker's aircraft the morning he died. Everything was perfect. Engine timing, control surface alignment, cable tension within spec. The airplane was fine. But Parker was dead anyway. And McKenna knew why. That fraction of a second delay in the controls, that tiny bit of slack that the manual said was acceptable, it had killed Parker just like it had killed Morrison and Chin and 14 others. The worst part was the smell. Every morning McKenna worked in the maintenance area. The smell of aviation fuel and hot metal and hydraulic fluid filled his nose. It was the smell of aircraft preparing for combat. Some of those aircraft would come back. Some wouldn't. and McKenna would be there the next morning, smelling the same smells, working on more aircraft, watching more pilots walk out to machines that couldn't respond fast enough to keep them alive. On the evening of August 16th, Hayes came to the maintenance area, found McKenna working on his assigned P-38. Hayes asked if there was anything McKenna could do to make the airplane roll faster, anything at all. Hayes said he didn't care if it was regulation or not, he just wanted a chance. McKenna looked at Hayes, saw the fear, saw the desperation, saw a kid who knew he was going to die if something didn't change. McKenna told Hayes to come back in the morning. He'd see what he could do. McKenna worked alone that night. The maintenance hangar was quiet after 2,300 hours. Most of the crew had gone to sleep. The only sounds were the distant rumble of generators and the buzz of insects against the overhead lights. The air smelled like engine oil and tropical humidity. He pulled the inspection panel off Hayes's P-38 left boom. The metal was still warm from the day's sun. Inside, the aileron control cable ran through a series of pulleys toward the tail section. McKenna grabbed the cable with both hands and pulled, felt the slack. Maybe 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension caught. His hands were covered in grease and his fingers ached from a full day of maintenance work. But he could feel that slack. Clearly. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong. The piano wire came from a salvaged P-38 that had ground-looped 2 weeks earlier. The aircraft was scrap, but McKenna had pulled useful parts before it went to the depot, including a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire from the rudder trim system. He'd kept it in his tool bag without really knowing why. Now he knew. He sat on the hangar floor with the wire and a pair of pliers, bent it into a Z shape. The wire was stiff, fought back against the pliers. His hands slipped twice. Cut his thumb on the second try. The blood made the wire slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept working. Took him 8 minutes to get the bend right. The Z shape would act as an inline tensioner, would add just enough preload to the cable to eliminate the slack. Installing it was harder. The space inside the boom was tight. McKenna had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. The beam kept moving. Shadows jumped across the cable system. His shoulder wedged against the boom structure. The metal edge cut into his arm. He could feel sweat running down his back despite the night air. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. His fingers fumbled with the clevis pin. Dropped it. Heard it bounce somewhere in the boom. Spent 5 minutes feeling around in the dark until he found it. The whole time his heart was pounding. If the engineering officer found him doing unauthorized modifications to a flight control system, he'd face a court-martial. Possibly a dishonorable discharge. Maybe prison time. But Hayes was going to die if McKenna didn't do something. He inserted the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley. Reconnected the cable. The fit was tight. He had to force the clevis pin through. When it finally seated, he tested the tension by hand. Pulled on the cable. No slack. The control surface moved immediately. Perfect. McKenna replaced the inspection panel, cleaned up his tools, wiped the blood off the wire and his hands. Walked out of the hangar at 01:15. The tropical night was humid and still. Somewhere in the distance, he heard aircraft engines. Japanese night raiders, probably. The sound made his stomach clench. He'd just modified a flight control system without authorization, used a non-standard part, violated at least a dozen regulations. If the modification failed during flight, Hayes would crash, and McKenna would be responsible. But if it worked, Hayes might live. McKenna went to his bunk, didn't sleep, watched the ceiling until dawn. At 06:30, he walked to the flight line, watched the crew fuel and arm Hayes's aircraft, watched Hayes walk out for his pre-flight briefing, watched him climb into the cockpit. At 07:42, Hayes took off. McKenna stood on the flight line and watched the P-38 climb into the morning sky, watched it join formation with 16 other aircraft, watched them head northwest toward Japanese airspace. And then all he could do was wait. The engagement started at 08:14. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s intercepted 9 Zeros at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. The morning sun was behind them. Perfect setup for a diving attack. Hayes was flying number 3 position. His element leader called out the bounce. They rolled in. Hayes picked a 0 at the back of the formation, dove from altitude, built speed to 380 miles per hour. The 0 grew larger in his gun sight. Hayes could see the painted rising sun on the fuselage, could see the pilot's head in the canopy. He pressed the trigger. The 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon hammered. Tracers reached out. Most missed. A few hits sparked off the 0's wing. Not enough. The 0 snap-rolled right and dove. Hayes rolled to follow. That's when he felt it. The airplane responded instantly. No delay. No lag. The stick moved and the aircraft rolled immediately. Hayes had never felt his P-38 move like that. It was like the airplane had been waiting for his command and executed it the moment he gave it. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the normal time. Got his nose down. The Zero was right there in his sight picture. He fired again. 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Zero's engine exploded. Pieces flew off. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell toward the jungle below, trailing black smoke. Hayes' first kill. But there was no time to celebrate. His wingman called out Zeros diving from above. Hayes looked up, saw 3 of them coming down in a shallow dive, coming fast. They'd seen him shoot down their friend. Now they wanted revenge. Hayes shoved the throttles forward, started to climb, but the Zeros were faster in the dive. They'd be on him in seconds. His only option was to reverse and fight. Every instinct screamed at him to keep climbing, keep running. That was the doctrine. But doctrine meant dying today. He rolled hard left, pulled. The P-38 snapped around like nothing he'd ever experienced. The nose came through the horizon. He saw the lead Zero. It was turning to follow him, but hadn't expected Hayes to reverse that fast. The Zero was in a bad position, exposed. Hayes pulled lead, fired, hit the Zero in the left wing root. The wing folded. The Zero tumbled. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The other 2 Zeros tried to scissor with him, alternating turns to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed direction, his P-38 snapped into the turn instantly. No delay, no fighting the controls. The airplane did exactly what he wanted, the moment he wanted it. It was like flying a different aircraft, like someone had removed invisible weights from the control system. 1 Zero made a mistake. Reversed too hard, bled too much speed. Hayes got inside his turn. Close range, maybe 200 feet. He fired. Couldn't miss. The Zero came apart. Pieces of aircraft fell past Hayes' canopy. He felt the P-38 shudder as debris hit his right boom. 3 kills. The 4th Zero ran. Hayes didn't chase. He was low on fuel and ammunition. He climbed back to altitude, reformed with what was left of his flight. They headed home. The entire engagement lasted 7 minutes. When Hayes landed at Dobadura at 0903, McKenna was waiting on the flight line. Hayes shut down the engines, climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He walked straight to McKenna. Hayes said 2 words. It worked. What neither of them realized was that 6 other pilots had watched Hayes' engagement from altitude. Captain Frank Mitchell saw the entire fight from 15,000 feet. Mitchell was a flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group. He'd been watching Hayes' element engage the Zeros below when he noticed something unusual. Hayes' P-38 was rolling faster than any Lightning Mitchell had ever seen. The aircraft snapped through maneuvers like it weighed half what it should. Mitchell knew every pilot in the theater, knew their skill levels. Hayes was good, but not that good. Something was different about his airplane. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. Hayes was still amped up on adrenaline, hands shaking as he filled out the combat report. 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell asked him what was different. Hayes said he didn't know. His airplane just responded better today. Faster. Mitchell asked if maintenance had done anything to the aircraft. Hayes said he should talk to Technical Sergeant McKenna. Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area 2 hours later. McKenna was working on a different P-38. His hands were black with grease. His coveralls were stained with hydraulic fluid. Mitchell asked him directly, "What did you do to Hayes' airplane?" McKenna looked at him for a long moment, then told him, "The piano wire tensioner, the cable modification, the unauthorized change to the flight control system." Mitchell listened without interrupting. When McKenna finished, Mitchell asked if he could do the same modification to Mitchell's aircraft. McKenna said yes, but Mitchell had to understand the risks. The modification wasn't approved, wasn't tested. If something went wrong, both of them would face charges. Mitchell said he didn't care. He'd lost 4 pilots in his flight in the past month, all caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. If there was something that could help them survive, he wanted it. Regulations could wait. That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38. Same piano wire tensioner, same installation method. Mitchell flew it the next morning, came back raving about the improvement. The airplane rolled like a fighter instead of a truck, he told his wingman. The wingman told McKenna he wanted the modification too. By August 20th, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft. Word spread through the squadron. Pilots started asking their crew chiefs if they'd heard about the cable modification. Some crew chiefs refused, said it was against regulations. Others were willing to try. McKenna showed them how. Cut the piano wire, bend it into a Z shape, install it as an inline tensioner. Takes 8 minutes, changes everything. The modification spread pilot to pilot and mechanic to mechanic. No official documentation, no engineering approval, just whispered conversations in the ready room and maintenance area. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd using the modified controls. Mitchell got 3 on August 25th. Other pilots started coming back from missions with kills. The statistics were impossible to ignore. Lieutenant James Watkins was a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group stationed at Guisap. He heard about the modification from a pilot who transferred from Dobadura. Watkins was skeptical, but he tried it on one aircraft. The pilot came back from the next mission with his first kill after 8 weeks of combat. Watkins modified 4 more aircraft. Other crew chiefs in the 49th started doing it too. By early September, maybe 40 P-38s in New Guinea had the modification. The engineering officer at Dobadura noticed something was different, but couldn't figure out what. Control cable tensions checked out during inspections, because the crew chiefs removed the tensioners before inspections and reinstalled them afterward. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew. Nobody told the officers. The kill ratio started shifting. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific lost 2 P-38s for every 0 destroyed. In August, it was 1.3 to 1. By September, it was nearly even. Something had changed, but officially, nobody knew what. Then the Japanese noticed. Japanese fighter pilots first reported the change in late August. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet mentioned that American P-38s were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction more quickly. The reports noted that tactics which had worked reliably for months were suddenly failing. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's top aces. 64 confirmed kills. He'd been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. On September 3, 1943, Sakai engaged a P-38 over Wewak. He used his standard tactic, drew the American into a turning fight, waited for the P-38 to begin its roll, then snapped his turn back the opposite direction to get inside the American's turning radius. Except the P-38 reversed with him. Sakai had executed this maneuver dozens of times. He knew exactly how long it took a P-38 to roll, knew the timing perfectly. But this P-38 rolled faster than it should have. Sakai barely avoided a head-on collision. The American got guns on him. Sakai had to dive away. He returned to base confused and frustrated. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently. They were still using the same tactics, but their aircraft were responding faster. Fractionally, but enough to matter. Enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed P-38s, found no obvious modifications. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they'd been fighting for months. The engines were the same. The armament was the same. Nothing visible had changed. What the Japanese didn't know was that the change was hidden inside the boom, a 6-inch piece of piano wire that looked like original equipment. Even if they'd found it, they might not have understood its purpose. It wasn't a new weapon system, wasn't a new engine, just a minor modification to control cable tension. But that minor modification was killing their pilots. By mid-September, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-38s at rates they hadn't seen since early in the war. The psychological impact was significant. For 2 years, Zero pilots had owned the sky in turning fights. They knew they could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew. That confidence was breaking down. Pilots who used to press attacks were becoming cautious, hesitant. They weren't sure anymore if their tactics would work. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some pilots stopped trying to get into turning fights with P-38s, used hit-and-run tactics instead. But that meant giving up their main advantage. The Zero's strength was maneuverability. Fighting like a P-38 meant fighting on American terms. And the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, and could take more damage. Other pilots tried to compensate by being more aggressive, closing to shorter range before firing, taking more risks. But aggression without the ability to outturn the enemy just meant dying faster. Several experienced Japanese pilots were killed in September trying tactics that had worked perfectly in July. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. They knew something had changed, but they didn't know what, and they couldn't figure out how to counter it. You can't develop tactics against a modification you don't know exists. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s. American losses in the same period were 22 aircraft. The ratio had reversed. For the first time in the Pacific War, P-38s were killing Zeros at a better than 1-to-1 rate. Japanese command ordered pilots to avoid engaging P-38s unless they had significant numerical advantage. That order marked a turning point. The Zero had gone from hunter to hunted, and it all came down to a piece of piano wire that nobody was supposed to install. The modification never became official during the war. The Army Air Force Engineering Command learned about it in October 1943. When a maintenance inspector at Dobadura noticed inconsistent cable tension readings. He traced the discrepancies to the piano wire tensioners, wrote a report, sent it up the chain of command. The report sat on desks for 3 weeks, while officers debated what to do. The modification violated regulations, but it was working. Fighter squadrons using the modification had measurably better kill ratios. Pilots were surviving. The question wasn't whether the modification helped. The question was whether to punish the mechanics who'd installed it without authorization, or quietly approve it after the fact. In November, Lockheed sent an engineering team to New Guinea to evaluate the modification. They tested it, measured the cable tension, calculated the stress loads, ran flight tests. Their conclusion was that the modification was safe and effective. It should have been part of the original design. Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J model that entered production in December 1943, but McKenna never received official credit. No commendation, no medal, no mention in any report. The official Lockheed documentation attributed the control system improvement to engineering analysis. McKenna's name didn't appear anywhere. Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions, shot down 11 Japanese aircraft, returned to Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, had 4 children, worked as a crop duster for 37 years. He never forgot what McKenna had done. Every year on August 17th, Hayes called McKenna to thank him for saving his life. Mitchell also survived. He became a squadron commander, led his unit through the Philippines campaign, shot down 16 aircraft. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, retired as a colonel in 1963. He told the story of McKenna's modification to every young maintenance officer he supervised, made sure they understood that sometimes the best solutions come from enlisted mechanics who see problems the engineers miss. McKenna stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946, returned to California, went back to working on cars, opened his own garage in Long Beach in 1948. He worked on engines for 42 years. Never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was a mechanic, fixed airplanes, that's all. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications found references to the piano wire tensioner in maintenance logs from New Guinea. The historian tracked down McKenna through veteran registries. McKenna was 73 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage. The historian asked him about the modification. McKenna confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. The historian estimated that the modification may have saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives based on survival rate improvements in squadrons that used it. McKenna said he never counted. He just remembered the pilots who came back. Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, the others. That was enough. James McKenna died in 2006 at age 88. He was buried in Pacific View Memorial Park in California. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the piano wire tensioner. Did not mention that he'd changed how American fighters flew. Did not mention that he'd broken regulations to save lives. His garage in Long Beach is still there, different owner now, but on the wall in the back office, there's a faded photograph. A young mechanic in coveralls, standing next to a P-38 Lightning. The date written on the back is August 1943, New Guinea. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees. Through sergeants and mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping these stories alive. At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant John George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. 27 years old, Illinois state champion, 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves, and in the past 72 hours, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. The other platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart. When he had unpacked the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armorer wanted to know if this was meant for deer or Germans. George explained it was for the Japanese. They shipped out before the rifle arrived. George spent the voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their Garands, while his own weapon sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December of 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked "Fragile." Inside was the rifle he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. The rifle weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The Garand issued to every other man in his battalion weighed 9.5 pounds with no magnification. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds. The Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December of 1942. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field. They had held it. But they had not taken Mount Austin, and they had not cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it the Gifu. 500 men, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days. They lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally took the western slope on January 2nd. By then, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz was different. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and dug into the massive trees. Some of those soldiers were snipers. They had scoped Arisaka Type 98s. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. The battalion commander summoned George that night. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George explained his credentials. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. 23 years old at the time. Youngest winner in the state's history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. If you want to see how George's civilian rifle performed against Japanese snipers trained for jungle warfare, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to George. George spent the night checking his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it again. He checked the scope mounts. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee. Military ball ammo. The same cartridge the Garand fired. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence said the Japanese snipers operated from the large trees in that area. Banyan trees. Some of them reached 90 feet tall, with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper could climb one of those trees before dawn and sit there all day without being seen. George had brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle and a canteen and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began to watch the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification. Not much, but enough to see movement in the branches that the naked eye would miss. The jungle was never silent. Birds, insects, the distant sound of artillery. George had learned to filter out the noise and focus on movement. He glassed the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17 he saw it. A branch moved. No wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man. Dark clothing. Positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies. George adjusted his scope. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 3.5 pounds. He had spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches. His body tumbled 90 feet and hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. The empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round. He kept his scope on the tree. Waited for movement. Nothing. The sniper's partner would be close. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere in that tree, or in the trees nearby. George scanned the surrounding banyans. The scope's 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy created shadows that made shapes impossible to distinguish without careful observation. At 9:43, he found the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower. maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have moved after taking the shot. That was basic sniper doctrine: shoot and relocate. But in a jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. George found him at 11:38, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese snipers adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 08:15. By 08:45, enough visibility had returned for work. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 09:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The sound of rain masked movement. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday. Also smart. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell. The 6th kill brought a response George had not anticipated. At 09:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third salvo would hit the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater as the third salvo hit. The bunker he had occupied moments before disappeared in explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a different position, a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The tree provided cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. They were now hunting him back. The dynamic had changed. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. At 14:23, George killed his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he killed his 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan tree. Good concealment, but the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 now dead, 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 0300, he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 04:15. By 05:30, it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position, not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 07:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved. George began glassing trees. At 08:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, low, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But George was not at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks. The angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He had killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes. They would not position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them. Unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. He checked every tree within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 minutes. At 0828, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was positioned in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there, or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George was not at the fallen tree and begin searching for him. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it. A slight shift. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran. He moved east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 0834, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan magnification made distant shapes visible but not identifiable. Every dark spot could be a branch, or a man. George had to study each one carefully. At 0947, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George saw the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape moving through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using the jungle floor vegetation for cover, ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled. But the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. Rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 0952. He had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the primary skill of sniper work, the ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 0958, the Japanese sniper began moving again. He crawled forward, 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side. the side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper had watched the machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater. But he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass, 38 yards. An easy shot even without a scope. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers, men who had been killed because they made mistakes. This man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy, another bait position. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier. 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not moving, not repositioning, just watching, waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He could not shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That gave them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water, slowly, silently. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices. Coming from the tree line. Multiple men, moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers had not been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. The Winchester he held vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling. These were not snipers. Infantry. A patrol or a recovery team sent to collect the bodies. George counted seconds. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater, close enough that he could hear them clearly even without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation. Urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again. Not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They had found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He had not been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester, 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options. Stay hidden and hope they passed by. Or fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards. 25 yards. 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down, directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting, more soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices. He ran 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater, around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low. He glassed the area through his scope, saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier, fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking, one group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact, move back toward American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots, branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again. Not running. Walking. Staying low. Using the terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was quiet. No voices. No movement. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry let him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 11 hits. Then a firefight with infantry. 3 more kills. 5 total rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He field-stripped the Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning every component. Cosmoline and gun oil. Patches run through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope mounts. Adjusted the eye relief. Loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. George walked to headquarters wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time, and rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with U-Nurdle scopes, sniper rifles left behind by the Marines, and Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with U-Nurdle scopes went to the men George would train. Training began on January 27th. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper. They had qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards, but none of them had combat experience as snipers. None of them had killed a man from concealment. George started with the fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the U-Nurdle scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the rifles stable, but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to terrain and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the men shoot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, the roles could switch. This kept both men proficient and prevented the single point of failure that came from relying on one shooter. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Guadalcanal River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not snipers, just infantry, stragglers who had not yet evacuated. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 0720, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day. 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. The number was conservative, only counted confirmed kills where the body could be observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamboga River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. They told George he would recover, but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was not finished. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came down from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission, something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth. George did not know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines, the kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new unit. 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet. The men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5,307 Composite Unit was officially designated on May 28, 1943, but the men had been training since April. Long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, operations without supply lines. The unit was modeled after British Brigadier Order Wingate's Chindits, small mobile forces that could operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role was not officially listed as sniper. The Army did not have formal sniper positions in its table of organization. George was designated as a rifle platoon leader, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command knew what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the principles remained the same. Heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The Burma jungle would be worse, steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy that knew the ground better than any American force. George modified his equipment for the Burma mission. The Winchester Model 70 had performed well on Guadalcanal, but that had been short-range operations with regular resupply. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce of weight mattered. George removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. The Weaver had the same 2.5 power magnification, but weighed 8 ounces less. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The modifications reduced the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February of 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture the Myitkyina airfield. The airfield was critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with approximately 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland, through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large forces. Mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, limited trails. The force would carry all supplies on their backs or with pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support, just rifles and mortars and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. The pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several had to be shot when they broke legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They had engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Small skirmishes, ambushes. Quick firefights followed by rapid withdrawal. The Marauders were not meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, to harass, to cut supply lines and create chaos behind Japanese positions. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march, once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing, once at 380 yards against a machine gun position, once at 290 yards against a sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. George never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, different from the Garand's sharp crack. 1 shot announced his presence. A 2nd shot would give the Japanese time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles. They had lost more men to disease than combat. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 men was down to fewer than 3,000 effectives. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The operation was a success, but the cost had been severe. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived, but the rifle that had proven so effective on Guadalcanal had been used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The Marauders rarely engaged in the kind of long-range precision shooting that required a scoped rifle. Most combat was close range, ambushes at 50 yards or less, firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. George realized something during those 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an excellent rifle, perhaps the best bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would require different weapons, different tactics. But there would be no next war for George. Not immediately. By June of 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the Marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the United States in July of 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons he had learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma, how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements. Probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at it. The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. The need for individual marksmen with privately owned rifles was fading. The military was standardizing. Mass production. Interchangeable parts. soldiers with identical equipment and identical training. George understood the necessity. Modern warfare required industrial scale. But something was being lost. The individual skill. The craftsman approach to soldiering. The idea that a man with the right rifle and the right training could change the outcome of a battle. George was discharged from the Army in January of 1947. Lieutenant Colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart. Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He studied politics. Graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C. as Executive Director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma during those years. He had colleagues who knew he had served in the Pacific, but they did not know about Point Cruz. They did not know about the Japanese snipers. They did not know about the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. In 1947, George decided to write down what had happened. Not for publication, just for his own record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and suggested publication. George was reluctant. The book was technical, detailed descriptions of rifles and ammunition and ballistics, not the kind of content that interested general readers. But the NRA convinced him. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. The book described George's experiences on Guadalcanal and Burma with clinical precision. No embellishment, no hero worship, just facts and observations about what worked and what did not work in combat. The book is still in print today, still used as a reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He watched the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment. He watched the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle, but it is not. It is the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a male